Welcome to this edition of Security and Compliance Weekly. Today we welcome Anthony Palmeri from our sponsor, Ekron Systems. Anthony is going to facilitate a discussion about insider threats and what to do about them. Specifically, we're going to talk about how to build an insider threat program. We want to start off, though, first by making sure that we're all in agreement on our terminology. So we're going to talk about what is an insider threat and what are all the component parts and possible sources of insider threat. I have questions since I come from a DoD background that goes all the way back to the Cold War, frankly. So I want to hear what insider threat means in our modern terms. We might talk PCI, we might not. I said it just to get it in there. Second segment is when we'll focus on building the insider threat program and what are all the component parts to that. And again, how does compliance fit into it? Things like PCI. So join us as we continue our journey of tearing down silos and building bridges on Security and Compliance Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. And now, it's the show that bridges the requirements of regulations, compliance, and privacy with those of security. Your trusted source for complying with various mandates, building effective programs, and current compliance news. It's time for Security and Compliance Weekly. RSA offers business-driven security solutions that provide organizations with a unified approach to managing digital risk and designed to effectively detect and respond to advanced attacks, manage user access control, and reduce business risk, fraud, and cybercrime. For a limited time, get mobile multi-factor authentication from RSA Secure ID Access for free to help secure your remote or dynamic workforce long-term. Leverage push notification, biometric, and one-time password authenticators to secure access to your cloud applications, on-premises systems, legacy systems, privileged accounts, and more at no cost for 6 months. For more information, visit securityweekly.com/RSA Security.
Welcome to episode 59 of Security and Compliance Weekly, recorded on January 26, 2021. If you're attempting to listen to us live, you're not hearing us because we're having technical difficulties because most of the Northeast is apparently suffering some rolling wave of Verizon outages. So apologize to those loyal listeners that like to listen live. Of course, you're listening now on tape. And I guess technically it's not tape, it's all digital. Anyway, I'm your host, Mr. Jeff Mann, and joining me today are my illustrious co-hosts, Mr. Scott Lyons, Mr. Josh Marpet, and Mr. Frederick, or as we call him, Flea Lee. Welcome, gentlemen. Hey, do you want to stay in the loop on all things Security Weekly? Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe on your favorite podcast catcher or also on the YouTube channel. Or you can also sign up for our mailing list. And of course, you can join us on the Discord server where we're trying to stream the show through the After Party channel and get everybody that's listening to be able to hear us somewhat because we're geeks. We're trying to make it work. Anyway, also, if you have a specific guest or topic suggestion that you want us to cover on any of our shows, future shows, you can submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and completing the form. We review these suggestions on a regular basis, some say monthly, and we will reach out to you once we've reviewed them. All right. As I stated in the intro, today we're talking to Anthony Palmeri from Ekron Systems, and we're going to be talking insider threat and how to build an insider threat program. Let's take a moment, though, to get to know Anthony. Anthony, welcome to Security and Compliance Weekly.
Hello, everybody. Nice to meet you. Thanks for having me this morning.
Appreciate you being here. Hey, we just want to get to know you a little bit. Anthony, tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into this thing we call cybersecurity, and how you ended up at Ekron System.
You bet. I appreciate it. Yeah, background really, got my start back in distribution years ago with just computer distribution, and then worked my way into the software industry. And lo and behold, was employee 79 at a small little company called Citrix Systems. So I learned virtualization right out of the gate years ago before it was even called that. We called it desktop management. But that took me into a networking background and later on into Remember the old days of probes living in the network and watching information come in and out of the network for forensic search. And that's how I started in this business. Also working with a company called EI Digital Security that was later picked up by Rapid7, which was a vulnerability assessment scanner way back. So security-wise, about 13, 14 years experience now, and ended up at ECRAN now lately, just with this new hot sector of insider threat. It's definitely a part of the landscape out there, security speaking wise, that many organizations have neglected.
Yeah, that's very true. And as I said, going back to my DoD days, and even the early days of this, internet security, the goal of hackers and bad guys back in the early days was to go from being on the outside to becoming part of the inside, part of the internal, stealing credentials, gaining a foothold, toehold. It's one of the reasons why I want to jump into sort of a discussion of defining our terminology and what is it, what exactly do we mean by insider threat. Last question before we do that, though, we like to ask our guests what we call the hot seat question, which is because we are Security and Compliance Weekly, and we do try to tie compliance into our discussions, perhaps ad nauseum, but it's what we're passionate about. Where do you fall on what we like to call the security versus compliance continuum? No right answers, just trying to get a feel for where you're coming from. Security versus compliance.
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to mind, it's a great question. Takes me back to the ITIL days, right? Doing things correctly in a computing fashion, if you will. And I think compliance is a broad statement, right? That's slewing out there many times to help organizations feel safe. But at the end of the day, I think there's many gaps in the security posture of the organization that are missed above and beyond compliance.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough.
That's really well said. That's actually, I can live with that. That's really well said. Well done, sir.
Not that we're giving credit for better
coming from you.
Not, but
appreciate it.
Josh, you want to, since you jumped in, you want to start off. We want to start defining our terms. What does insider threat mean to you, Josh? And we can all talk about defining the terminology.
Okay, so insider threat is an interesting term because these days, back up a step. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 100 years ago, when Jeff started, for example, I couldn't resist. I'm sorry, Jeff. But we've got the Cold War. The fact that...
Hey, we have pictures of you with hair back at that time, okay? We have pictures.
Yeah. Jeff, I thought you started in the Civil War. But... Sorry, I couldn't resist. No, seriously. In the early days of computing,
War when you lose.
Well, you were the early cyber squads. It was just different type of cyber warfare.
Insider threat in the U.S. goes back prior to the Civil War. It actually goes back to the Revolutionary War, when Governor Tryon of New York. No. Even before that, Governor Tryon of New York was going after Washington's lifeguards. And that right there is the first known of insider threat.
Lifeguards?
As well as, the lifeguards.
I don't remember seeing a swimming pool at Mount Vernon. When
I first read that they were called lifeguards, I had the exact same reaction. But Washington was surrounded by lifeguards, and Tyron was trying to recruit anybody over to the British side, right? And so that right there is the first, not only U.S. known wartime insider threat, but also the beginning of the Office of Strategic Service, the OSS, to be able to do counterintelligence and counterinsurgency.
So, okay,
regardless of when it started,
just for a second.
Well, no, not just. Well, to sum up, maybe you were going the same place, Josh. Insider threat, I think, classically means or connotes ideas of espionage, spying, somebody that's an employee, somebody that's on the inside that is turned, a turncoat. Right. Go ahead, John. But does it mean that today, or what else does it mean today?
Well, it still means similar things, but the implications have changed. And let me explain what I mean. Back when a company or an enterprise was well perimetered, you had a definitive or defined perimeter inside of which was everybody that works here, and outside of it was everybody that doesn't work here. Okay. These days, however, companies are, that term that's, definitely a Scrabble word, deperimeterized. And so now you've got companies that have employees. They've also got contractors. They've also got partners, affiliates. They've got, customers that have access to certain data, but not others. Other customers that have access to this data, but not certain data. It's a very much more of a mishmash of intent, of access, of who's inside. I mean, the whole term inside threat is inside the perimeter, inside the building, inside the whatever. These days, that doesn't even exist, especially this past year when work from home is literally the order of the year.
Great point.
True. That is an interesting perspective. To counter that, though, and one of the reasons why I wanted to spend some time defining terms is, and maybe I'll be corrected, but this is just my perspective where I'm coming from, which is my way of saying I think I'm right and everybody else is wrong. I have heard vendors talk about insider threat and then go on to describe things like an employee clicking on a phishing email, clicking the link, or downloading and opening the attachment, that type of thing. And I see that lumped in as an insider threat, and I'm like, I'm not so sure
that's not insider threat.
Fits the definition.
There's no malicious intent.
Yeah,
so there's
I
something
think
to do with
intent is really important when it comes to insider threat. I mean, because the entire notion, going back to Josh, et cetera, is this idea of like, we've already put somebody through the vetting process. We believe that for whatever reason that they're going to act within reasonable, perimeters. And I think that's really the idea. It's like, oh, yeah, you have somebody that you previously trusted that you can no longer trust. And it's not necessarily that it's somebody making accidents. Like otherwise, we're saying like, hey, all laptops are insider threat because you can get malware, et cetera. I think it's more helpful to focus on that intent.
Well, there's two types of insider threat, right? There's the digital and then there's the physical. And you look at people that have been very successful in the past, from espionage artists to corporate malfeasance. Of dealing with insider threat, it's very easy to sit back and say, well, how do you classify this? Is it technical or physical association, right?
Yeah, I think that's true to some extent. Somebody on Twitter the other day mentioned to me that they're watching a series on Netflix called Spycraft. And they thought I might like it. And I'm like, yeah, I might like that. So I watched a couple episodes. I don't know, there's 8 or 10 total. And I will neither confirm nor deny, but some of the ground that they're covering, and they're covering from mostly an historical perspective back to the Cold War, again, is talking about ways that data is exfiltrated, and data in this context is information, mostly the spoken word, people having conversations, and essentially what they were boiling down to, which I'm attempting as an illustration, Scott, of what you're saying, at least in a classical sense, is if there's people having a secret conversation in a conference room in an enclosed area in a building somewhere inside, let's say, the Kremlin, and information that is conveyed in that super secret meeting and in that room is found to have been leaked to the adversary. There's only so many ways that information could have gotten out. One of the two people, or maybe both of the people that are having the conversation, are spies, and they gave up the information, or there's the possibility that there's some way that the the language, the spoken word is being intercepted, and the episode I was watching was going on and on about all sorts of bugs and microphones and creative ways that the Soviets, the Russians, and they're really expert at it, ways of implanting bugs in rooms so that the conversations could be intercepted. There aren't that many more choices. It's either somebody is bad or you find out another way to get to the data. Anthony, when we had talked the other day, you had a slide that kind of talked about the sources of insider threat. I was wondering if you could show that to us, because I think it's a good talking, a good place to continue the conversation.
Absolutely. I'd love to share that.
Okay. And then we can kind of continue the conversation from there. Assuming the presentation gods are with us.
How does that look? Do you see that okay? That.
Perfect. There we go.
Perfect.
That's great.
Great. So
I think these are the type of. For those who aren't watching, can we get a verbal breakdown of what we're being shown?
Yeah, Anthony, if you just kind of walk us through the slide real quick, because a good portion of our audience just listens to this instead of watches.
Absolutely. So just on a definitive nature, the type of insider threats, and this is per Verizon, and some of it's backed up by Gartner, but essentially you've got malicious insiders or employees or partners who are within the organization that could be there for some personal gain. It would be their objective. You have inside agents, for example, somewhat of a spy, somebody that you mentioned earlier that you were talking about just recently, somebody that could be embedded into the organization and be there to help exfiltrate data. And then disgruntled employees. Let's face it, we have individuals that end up being dissatisfied with an organization, for example, and they're going to be either discharged or they're looking for a new opportunity. And with that, they're going to take some data with them, if you will. And then also careless workers is another prime example of an insider threat. Somebody who's overworked, for example, somebody who is not interested any longer in their role could become a careless worker. And I think all of us have fallen into the trap of phishing, where you click on a link and the minute you do it, you say, geez, I think I knew better, but I just did it, darn it. And then it happens. And then lastly, a third-party vendor, for example, maybe an MSP or somebody that's just serving all the applications to your organization and managing your footprint. They could have somebody in the organization that might even make a mistake at an administrational level, for example, and leave a rogue server running on the network where it leaves an open gate into the environment. And that rounds it out.
Okay, so in that context, what I was pointing out in terms of somebody that clicks on a phishing link, they recognize that as a category, but it's just one of many. I think I can live with that. Flea, you had mentioned earlier something about vetting employees, and that was one of the things that I was thinking of in terms of, okay, how do you prevent or minimize the likelihood of somebody falling into any one of these categories of insider threat? And the first thing I thought was, well, what about pre-employment screening? I mean, when I went to work for the DoD, I had to, well, there are all sorts of different things. I had to have a physical. I had to have a psychological exam. I passed. Lie detector test. So on and so forth. And the lie detector test is something actually you had to redo every couple of years. I know that doesn't play well in the commercial world, but what, in your experience, Flea or Anthony or anyone, does vetting or pre-employment screening, what does that do to try to minimize the likelihood of any one of these insider threats sources, let's call them?
Yeah, and on the vetting and the pre-employment, I think for most people in the commercial world, what we're familiar with is just the classic, work background check, right? And the idea behind that being that if you've had some kind of like criminal past or those kind of things, there is a belief that you might be more likely to actually do that again, or that you might be in a position that's easy to compromise. And for those people that have worked in finance or in the financial space, it's not uncommon for those background checks to include things like credit checks, just to see like, hey, is this somebody who is going to have access to money, access to the ability to actually transfer money, et cetera, that is in some dire financial need, like who's going to be easily tempted. And then I think the other thing that becomes somewhat common, and still, even here in California, is not an unusual practice, is drug screening. Kind of like this whole idea, like, hey, are there external forces? In this case, maybe some kind of addictive substance that makes it easy to, kind of as our guest has said earlier, turn somebody, right? Like take somebody who was previously good or whatever and tempt them to actually do something bad. And that could either be because of previous criminal affiliations, that could be because of, some kind of financial stress that they're undergoing, or then, ultimately because maybe some kind of, addiction issue that they're dealing with.
Yeah, back in the DoD days, they recognized all those different types of things, and they, part of the pre-employment screening, like all the questions you would get during the lie detector test, addressed different things like lifestyle, finances, political affiliations, and loyalties, and it was all based on because people had, committed espionage in the past, and they did it either because they saw it as a way to make a lot of money, because they had gambling problems, they had a lot of debt, or they just had rich and fancy tastes. There was people that in the past had been leverage, yeah, and speaking of leverage, blackmailing people, not as much as an issue these days, but back in the 40s and 50s, alternate lifestyles and threatening to make that public. It was a motivation for people to commit espionage, or the political motivations. I don't like the way that this may not resonate right now. I don't like the direction the country is going, so I want to change things. I want to disrupt things, and I want to steal secrets in order to try to overthrow the existing form of government. That type of thing. None of this resonates today, of course.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things that we always have to remember about these pre-employment checks is that they are definitely not perfect. And, there's so much of it that it does a fairly decent job of kind of catching like the obvious and low-hanging fruit. Really, it helps you catch dumb criminals. Like, hey, yep, I'm planning on actually joining your fintech company, or I'm joining your bank because I actually want to exfiltrate money. Those are pretty easy to catch. I think it's where some of these more nuanced things happen. And one of the things that I'm more fascinated about with insider threat is more of the insiders that turn bad, right? Like the people who get into the company, they pass all the screening checks, they seem above ground, and oftentimes they legitimately are. And I think when you think about one of the classes like disgruntled employees, those often are people who turned up, they were really great, everybody's super excited, they passed all the background checks, but then something happened. And I think that's where we, need more help now with some, additional technology solutions, et cetera, to make it easier to kind of actually detect when somebody actually who has passed all the vetting then goes bad as a true insider.
I want to take this just a little bit differently and say on a national level, there are a couple of groups that are devoted towards insider threat. And in the Discord, I'm dropping a link to National Insider Threat sig.org. If you get a chance, go and check them out. It's run by a good friend of mine by the name of Jim Henderson. They deal directly with trying to identify new ways, tactics, and techniques of how to say that an insider threat is actually an insider threat.
No, it's funny.
When I get a chance, go check them out.
Thank you for sharing.
Go ahead,
that,
guys.
Scott. We will look at it. Not so much insider threat related, I guess, but just as a comment, because there's you're sharing this source to look things up. back when I used to work for the DoD, we had something called the Threat Office, and they would monitor what was going on in the world. And like if you were planning a trip to, say, Central Europe, you're supposed to call the Threat Office or get in touch with the Threat Office and find out what's going on there. And if what the threat level was in terms of like terrorism or espionage or civil unrest and things like that. So I'm curious to look at this to just see how much it relates to stuff I'm familiar with, which is less and less as time goes on. So insider threat, I think we're all agreeing on a definition that it has something to do with being on the inside of what might be in question these days, since the perimeter has kind of changed, and really it's different people that have different roles within an organization that might have different motivations or accidentally, unknowingly, or even be tricked into doing something that reveals data, leaks data, sensitive data, and so on and so forth. I mentioned roles there, and I wonder, the other thought I've had, just thinking about the definitions of it, and in terms of how does this fit into like a compliance world, like PCI. PCI is very big on, in a classical sense. I know you have to manually do it because of our kludgy setup today.
Well, I don't want to blow people's eardrums out.
What we call role-based access control in the lingo, but essentially what we used to just call need to know. Limiting access to sensitive information to only those people with a business function or a need to know it up to and including people with elevated privileges, administrators and stuff like that. I think we'll probably talk more about that in the second segment as we start talking about building the program. So that's more of a teaser, but it's something I want to me, I think it starts with, if you want to minimize insider threat, get a control of who your insiders are and what they're doing, and not let the inside just be this, soft, chewy middle, the way it sort of classically has been throughout the years. Around the horn real quick, any other thoughts, things that are burning that you want to say in terms of defining our terminology on insider threat? I'll go around the horn real quick. Flea, anything to add?
So, well, I'll
Scott,
take the first stab at it.
No particular order.
In the Discord, coming out of the National Insider Threat SIG, again, National Insider Threat SIG.org, they go through and they put in the definition of insider threat, and I actually copy and pasted that over to the Discord. So if you're part of the Discord, you're getting to see this. However, insider threat can be broken down into a couple of things, right? So an outsider with connections to the insider, employee threats, unwitting or careless employees, malicious, disgruntled employees, job jumpers, or opportunists. Sexual harassment turns into workplace violence can be insider threat. An employee with divided loyalty or allegiance to the U.S. Employee espionage. Data loss, theft of property, or assets by the employee. So when you're talking about insider threat, you're really looking at what kind of risk does an employee bring into the business, and what are those risks? What do they transfer into or transpire into, or how do they shift over time? So being able to define what that looks like from a policy perspective on how you identify an insider, or at least keeping that policy internal to HR, is very difficult for companies nowadays that don't understand, hey, humans are your biggest risk inside of a business, but they're also your biggest asset. So a lot of companies actually struggle with, how do you keep somebody from becoming an insider versus how do you capitalize on them and what they do and what their strengths are as an added value and benefit to the business.
This is a very exhaustive list. Thanks for posting it up there, Scott. I think it roughly would fall into the 5 categories that Anthony was sharing. So that's cool. Pet peeve, not on you, but on them. I don't see this as a definition. I see this as a list of examples, whereas the definition should be some short statement of somebody on the inside that does something bad, something along those lines. Flea, do you have something?
I think, the big thing for me that I keep pushing back on, and this is just me, I guess, disagreeing with some of the definitions here, it's hard for me to quantify someone who is not intentionally, going against security controls. Right. When I think about the individual who clicks on a phishing link, that doesn't feel like an insider threat to me. That feels more like, just classic compromise. Most of the time when I think about insider threat, I always come back to intent. And the intent doesn't have to be malicious. It really just has to be that somebody is intentionally circumventing security controls or security policies. Right, things that are meant to help keep the company and the corporation safe. Somebody's intentionally deviating from that, and that could be in the form of somebody saying like, "Hey, you know what? There's a software patch, or I need to actually change some code. I'm going to, skip over the code checks, skip over the peer review, et cetera. I'm going to push it directly to production." That's an insider threat. Somebody just clicking on a link, however, outside of maybe you've explicitly said, hey, never do this inside the company, doesn't really feel like somebody intentionally circumventing one of those controls.
So wait, back, stop. Flea, brilliant, really good point. So somebody clicking on a link is unintentional, doesn't realize they're causing damage, doesn't realize they're not actually circumventing controls. They're just doing their job. It happens to be a bad call because somebody's trying to break into their stuff, right? So far, so good?
Yep.
But somebody that is like, this code promotion rules, that it's BS. I know this is going to fix the problem. I know it's no big deal. What's the problem? I'm just going to use this loophole and promote my code to production, breaking the controls. That is not intending to cause harm, but the intention is to bypass practices and controls.
Yep.
That's
and
still an
when
insider
you
threat.
think about when you go back to some of the examples of other places being compromised, there definitely were insiders involved in it, and they believed that they were doing something that was wrong, but they didn't realize, they didn't understand the extent of the impact. They're like, oh, well, hey, you know what? I'm just going to let my buddies or these random people that I met on the street, hey, they paid me $5. They just want to come into the office and use the restroom. That kind of thing. Less so than, like somebody literally just making an accident. Like, say, somebody that got shoulder surfed into the office. The whole nine. That's not really the same thing as an insider threat. And I think, when you think about this idea naturally, I want to believe that most people's natural inclination is thinking that somebody is intentionally doing something, not necessarily somebody who accidentally did something.
Right. And it's fascinating. And I'm realizing that we've done damn near our entire first half hour segment. And I think we've got about 40 seconds of our guest. But, the point is that just defining insider threat, and now I think we've defined it to all of our satisfaction. It is either malicious or intentional bypassing of controls from somebody who has access to infrastructure or data on the inside, in the internals of an organization. It's not perfectly proper, but are we all roughly there?
I think I think that's roughly okay. I would I would expand on controls to just simply the rules or the policies, maybe.
Right. Same idea.
Because there's not a control to prevent me from doing everything that I'm not supposed to be doing in any organization. There's expectation. There's the rules of engagement that you sign, or the ethics policy, or whatever the organization calls it. You astutely noticed, Josh, that we haven't heard much from Anthony. He gets most of the second segment because he's going to walk us through the steps associated with building an insider threat program. I apologize to Anthony, but you've had your rest and you've had a chance to warm up to us. I think the live stream is back, so we're good to go. We're gonna take a break, come back, and jump into building an insider threat program. Don't go away.